Well, hello, and welcome to our first installment of Cracking the China Code with Ben. Now, I got some viewer questions about how Chinese people think and how that's different from how Americans think. And I have a confession for you. I studied history, okay? So it's my job to kind of spend a lot of my time alone in my room pontificating this stuff, just hoping and praying that someone will someday ask me about it. And thank you, dear viewers, because you started me up, and I'm just gonna keep talking until Matt turns off the camera. No, I'm gonna try to keep it quick for you guys. So the question was, what are the differences between how Americans and Chinese think? Well, there are a lot of differences. I'll start with a story that one of my students was telling me about. So I showed her a really good video that you should check out called The Empathic Society. The Empathic Civilization. It's on TED. I'll throw a link in there. Really good RSA animate thing. And the basic idea was that technologies like writing, and then later like radio and TV and print media, and then finally stuff like the internet and computers, allows people to sympathize emotionally and identify with people that are really, really far away. Right? And so the basic idea is that people's sphere of caring is getting bigger, and so Americans start to care about what happens in Africa, so they send money over there, and it forges this larger community, right? And that's the basic idea of the video. And so I was talking about this with one of my students, and I said, well, how does this, what does this have to do with China? What do you think about this idea? And she thought the idea was fine. She said, in general, that seems to make sense. And so I said, well, what I think is interesting is that I can, use my smartphone and take a picture and send it to my dad, and in 2 seconds, he can identify with, this like a little kid who's, happy in a village somewhere, or like an old lady who's like really surprised to have a foreigner there taking pictures of her or something like that. And what my students said was, yeah, that's true, but the problem with this idea that America and China are going to make this big community of the mind and all this is that two people can see the same image and see something really different. So that's going to be a big problem with China. And so I was kind of interested by that. And so I was sort of probing what she meant by that. And what we keep coming back to is this really uniquely Chinese sense that they're different from everyone else in the world. Now, me and Matt have talked a lot about how China doesn't feel like any other country on earth. And that when you leave China, you can kind of like feel it right away, kind of feel it come back, right? And so the Chinese, they have this really distinct sense of themselves as being different from everybody else, and you feel that all the time in a daily life. And what that comes from is this belief that there is a sort of a Chinese essence, right? And it's, I think it was Henry Kissinger in On China. He had a really good analogy. He said that this huge Chinese history, this 5,000-year tradition of literature and writing that stayed unchanged, right? So people today, they can still read Chinese texts from 5,000 years ago because all the characters are pretty much the same. A lot of other stuff in the language has changed, but it's still decipherable. And it's like a black hole that you get sucked into, right? And it presses you with your own sense of being limited in what you can achieve, and being limited in what your perspective on things can be. So in my experience, Chinese people have a very different way of looking at the world than Americans. Americans we're very concerned with strangers, but we're also very convinced that our sort of thoughts and ideas are influential and should be applied to strangers, right? I mean, you wind up identifying with these communities that you see on the TV or on the internet more than like with your neighbor. Right, so you're always concerned about strangers. So there's this like top-down picture of the world that Americans get. They're sort of like way up here, they're the eye, the eagle looking down on everyone saying, this is how this should be, that's how this should be. They want to comment on how things are in the economy, or how things are in politics, how things are in society, right? The Chinese actually, in my experience, don't have that urge. And that was something that was really confusing to me over here at first, was I didn't understand why people didn't have that same idea. And part of that has to do with regionalism in China. The Chinese, like strangers, are not something that the Chinese are super comfortable with, I think. And I keep saying the Chinese here. I'm not saying this applies equally to all Chinese people. I'm saying that like a sort of average Chinese person would sort of be this way. but there's not a tradition of dealing with strangers a lot. In America, there is a tradition of dealing with strangers. We're all from different countries. There's no such thing as an American race, right? People move around America all the time, right? And so it doesn't really matter where you're from. Your history doesn't really matter. What sort of matters is, what you present to other people, and that's just really like upfront. And so Americans are comfortable dealing with strangers. The Chinese really aren't. Travel is a super recent thing in China. The idea of leaving your home province and going to a different place is super new, right? And so in a place like Huizhou, there's still this big gap between local people and people who aren't local. They still have different ideas. They have different languages, for crying out loud. They eat different foods. They have these separate communities. And so that has something to do with it. That it's not super intuitive for Chinese people to empathize with people, from far away. The feeling over here is sort of tribal. You're the people at your job, the people who mentor you, the people in your family, right? Your professors at school. Those people wind up being really important in your life. And so does this like sense of a really, really big China. So you're kind of like in China, you're at the bottom looking up. And that changes your perspective on things quite a lot, right? Because as an American, from the top looking down, you say things like, I need to buy a car that, like, a hybrid car that won't do emissions, right? So you're concerned about the environment. You're really concerned about like social policies. Well, in China, the intuitive idea is to look at your life and just be like, what can I do about that? Like all of these systems, all of these things, this huge society up there, is it's doing all this stuff, and that just has nothing to do with me. So the sort of view that you take of your life in China, it's like you're a sort of bit character in a huge Broadway production or whatever. Americans all think that they're the protagonist in the movie of their own life. The Chinese, they're like an extra, right? They're just happy to be participating, and so that's a really big difference. And the other difference, I think, so we can say that Americans look at the top down, so they're very concerned with strangers, and they build communities with people they don't know. Whereas the Chinese, it's from the bottom up, so they want to build communities with people they do know, people that have a tangible influence on their life, and they're not concerned with these big questions, right? That's just not something that they would waste their time on. And the other big difference, I would say, is the belief, the American belief or the Western belief that there can be change in the world. So when you think about, I don't know, if you want to talk about the Bible or something, the story in the Bible is that the world had a definite beginning, right? Some stuff happened, like Adam and Eve were in the garden, and then, they did the bad thing, and God kicked them out, and then, Jesus came and was like, here's the deal, there's a path, back to salvation, right? And you need to take this covenant. And then, the Christians are going to do good works in the world, and they're going to do enough eventually, and then the world's going to end, right? So, chaos and upheaval and change are part of a progression through history. And so that winds up informing how a lot of Americans think about the world. They are totally willing to take hypotheticals seriously. They're willing to say, like, all these things that we have right now, it's just kind of a house of cards, right? It's fragile, it's going to come apart anyway, so we might as well change it. We might as well make it into something else that we want it to do. Whereas in China, there's a sort of Confucian and Taoist and Buddhist idea, that runs through all three of those traditions, that there's like an essence of China that you really can't change. That things have been the same for as long as anyone can remember. And one of my students, she's a Buddhist, I was asking her about, this Buddhist idea about reincarnation, that people who are high up on the social ladder, they did good works in their last life, and people who are low did bad works. So, from that perspective, it's that sort of mutes the idea that you should try to change things how they are, because there's like this cosmic thing that's going to take care of that later. But it also revolves around this idea that China is like a closed system, separate from the rest of the world. Like I was asking her about, what's going to happen when I'm going to die, right? Because she's a Buddhist. And I was like, well, what happens if I die in China? And she's like, well, you're going to come back in America. And I was like, what do you mean? And she's gonna be like, in the next life you probably won't even come to China. So for her, and I think for a lot of people who think about foreigners this way, our time in China is just so tiny and so short. They're like, there's nothing they won't believe about how ignorant we can be about this place. There's this big idea that China is too big and too complicated to ever understand, and foreigners just see a tiny slice of it. But for me, it's like, I feel like I've made a lot of progress. In 2 years, I've come over here, and I've been learning about the language and learning about the culture and seeing all these different places. But for Chinese people, it's like that's a tiny scratch on the surface and I'll never understand it. And so when I asked her, I was like, well, if I spend a lot of time here in China, and I die here in China, can I come back as a Chinese? And she just cracks up like this, like that's the most ridiculous thing she's ever heard, a foreigner turning into a Chinese, because it's like this closed loop, right? And there's this idea of China that you really can't change, and the changes are slow and creeping and millennial. And so for like a social issue, maybe they'll have an opinion about where it should go, but it's not really important to them because it's not something they can influence. There's a sense that you're really, really small in China. And that's a big deal that influences how Chinese people think. And I would say the third thing that changes how Chinese people think, the last thing, is we have, this idea that China is sort of a closed system with a big essence and you're small and you can't touch it. You have this idea that Americans, look down from the top and they're concerned about strangers. China looks up from the bottom, and so they're concerned about things around them. The third thing that I would say really defines how Chinese people think is just the isolation from the outside world. I mean, I couldn't tell you how many hundreds of people, me and Matt have been the first foreigners that they've ever seen. I mean, this is a really, it's probably not hundreds, it's probably thousands. There are towns that we go to where there's never been a foreigner. I mean, it's like several times a day we meet people who say, this is the first time I've ever spoken to a foreigner. And so there's exposure to sort of, foreign like movies or media or like, you see Western stuff here a lot, but the actual contact with Westerners has been really small, and that just shapes, I think, how people think about Westerners. It'd be like if you sort of ran into an African bushman or something for the first time, and you just like never heard of this place they were from, and you never heard of any of these ideas that they subscribed to, and you wouldn't really know what to make of them either, and there would be big gaps in communication. And we sort of me and Matt, we make a lot of comic hay out of the sort of mismatches that happen when we're over here seeing this stuff, and we just, we look at something that the Chinese would be like, yes, it's very good. Like a candy shop that sells Japanese candy, and on the outside there's all these signs bashing Japan, like Yaidao belongs to China, and like we'll never stop resisting Japanese aggression and blah blah blah. And inside they just sell like Pocky and stuff, and you're like, and that threw me for a loop for the longest time. But because I think the sort of exposure to foreigners have been so limited, and people want to they're okay with that. They have this idea that they can look out into the world in China, from China, and they can see the outside world. They can take in what they want and then push out what they don't. There's this Chinese process of picking through foreign stuff and just like, oh, iPhones, that's good, we're going to take that in China. But these other ideas about children being independent and not having to listen to their parents, no, we're going to keep that out. But like Mercedes-Benz, okay, we'll let that in, right? So people shouldn't mistake foreign stuff for being the same thing as exposure to foreigners. And exposure to foreigners is actually something that's really, really small in China. So I hope this was helpful to you guys. If you have any more specific questions about China, let me know. I'll talk at you for as long as you like.
So the last part of this segment that we'd like to do is I will ask 2 or 3 questions from behind the camera and see what you have to say. Would you say that this idea of foreigners having the top-down approach and Chinese people having the bottom-up approach affects the way that you would learn a language in China? I've been asked this many times by subscribers. They say how easy it is to learn Chinese. And from my opinion, the biggest barrier is people not necessarily giving you a chance to progress because of all of the fake compliments that you actually get.
Oh yeah, that's a big thing that you're run into in China. If you speak any Chinese, people will be showering you with compliments the whole time. And me and Matt, we talk about having the first conversation, and this is like, oh wow, you're a foreigner, and you're like, yep, that's right, I am. And where are you from? Oh, I'm from America. Do you like China? Yes, I love China.
How many times have you had that conversation?
Oh, I couldn't even tell you. I mean,
Thousands.
I didn't speak a word of Chinese when I came here, and after a week, I had that conversation down pat. So it's kind of hard. It's hard to break through, I think, to people. But in China, I would say, if foreigners look at the world from the top down, and Chinese look at the world from the bottom up, what that means is you should not be learning Chinese from a textbook. You should really be learning it from talking with people, because the way that people talk is going to be really different than like a textbook or something.
So don't get haughty.
Yeah, but number one, don't get haughty. Your Chinese is not 1% as good as everyone will tell you it is.
Sometimes my favorite one is when people say, "Oh, it's better than mine."
Oh, you get that, yeah. And it's awkward, and it's kind of, you don't know what to make of it. But you should never take them seriously. Your Chinese is never better than theirs.
Right. Second question that I have is, do you think you are Winston Serpent ZA because you're wearing a suit jacket?
It's been said, not by me, but it's been said.
What do you think he's gonna think of that?
Well, I think that emulation is the most sincere form of flattery.
Fair enough. And what brand is that suit?
This is M&D.
M&D. London.
I recommend it heartily to everyone out there. This jacket was $30.
All right.
US.
And do you support you sound like a very world sensitive man, culturally sensitive man. Do you support ivory trade?
Ivory trade. Yeah, that intuitively seems fine. No. Not 100% clear where ivory comes from, but it seems it's basically just like a rock or something.
Yeah, it's some sort of stone.
I wouldn't worry about that too much. That seems fine.
Please don't yell at us. All right, we'll see you next time on Cracking the China Code with Ben.